The billionaire froze so completely that for 3 terrifying seconds, everyone in the crowded charity ballroom thought she had stopped breathing. Her 8-year-old daughter, a little girl who had not spoken a single word to a stranger in nearly 2 years, had just walked across the marble floor, taken the hand of a quiet single father standing near the service entrance, and whispered something that made the man's face turn pale. But what shattered Eleanor Whitmore most was not what her daughter had said. It was the way the stranger looked at the little girl, as if he had been waiting his entire life to hear those words. If you believe kindness can heal wounds, forgiveness can change lives, hope can survive even the darkest moments, and everyone deserves a second chance, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, leave a meaningful comment, and subscribe to our channel so our family can keep sharing stories that remind us that compassion still matters. Eleanor Whitmore had spent 12 years building an empire from a small technology company her late father had nearly lost to bankruptcy, and by 38 she had become one of the most powerful women in the country. Business magazines called her fearless. Investors called her brilliant. Competitors called her impossible to defeat. But none of those words mattered when it came to her daughter, Maisie. To Eleanor, Maisie was not an heir, not a billionaire's child, and certainly not a symbol of her success. She was the little girl who used to dance barefoot through their garden every morning, who collected yellow flowers and believed every bird had a different personality, who once insisted that every lonely person deserved a place at their breakfast table. Then, 2 years earlier, something terrible had happened during a family trip, and afterward Maisie had slowly withdrawn from the world. She stopped speaking to strangers. Then she stopped speaking at school. Eventually, she spoke only to her mother and her longtime tutor, and even those words became rare. Doctors found no simple explanation. Therapists offered possibilities but no miracle. Eleanor spent millions on specialists, private clinics, speech programs, and educational consultants, but nothing could reach the locked room inside her daughter's heart. That afternoon, Eleanor had brought Maisie to the annual Whitmore Foundation charity event because she wanted her daughter to see people helping other people. The ballroom was filled with wealthy donors, journalists, doctors, teachers, veterans, and volunteers. Waiters moved between tables carrying sparkling water and delicate pastries while sunlight poured through enormous windows overlooking the city. Eleanor had barely finished speaking with a foundation director when she noticed Maisie standing near the far end of the room. The little girl was staring toward a man who looked completely out of place among the polished executives. He wore a simple gray shirt, dark trousers, and an old watch. His hair was cut short, his posture was straight without being rigid, and his eyes constantly moved across the room as if he noticed every doorway and every person who entered. Beside him stood a 7-year-old boy with a red backpack, apparently his son. The man had been hired through a veterans organization to help coordinate the event's security and accessibility volunteers. His name was Callum Reed. Callum had once been a Navy SEAL, though almost nobody at the event knew it. He had left the military years earlier after a mission overseas changed everything. He returned with medals he never displayed, memories he never discussed, and a sense of guilt that followed him into civilian life. He had married his college sweetheart, Mara, and for a few precious years believed he had finally built a peaceful life. Then Mara died unexpectedly from a medical complication, leaving Callum to raise their son, Finn, alone. He had learned to cook meals his son would actually eat, braid the occasional school project into something presentable, attend parent meetings, work ordinary jobs, and hide the nightmares that sometimes returned when he least expected them. He never told people about the men he had lost. He never talked about the mission where he had made a decision that saved several lives but cost one innocent person dearly. Callum believed that some memories were meant to be carried, not explained. Maisie began walking toward him. Eleanor immediately followed, alarmed because her daughter rarely approached unfamiliar adults. Callum noticed the little girl but did not move toward her. He simply lowered himself slightly so he would not tower over her. Maisie stopped a few feet away. Her fingers trembled. Then, with tears gathering in her eyes, she whispered the first words she had spoken to an unfamiliar person in almost 2 years. She asked whether he was the man who had saved the little girl. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Callum looked at Maisie, then at Eleanor, and for a moment something deep and painful passed through his eyes. He quietly told Maisie that she must have mistaken him for someone else. But Maisie shook her head. She reached into the small pocket of her dress and pulled out a faded blue ribbon. Callum stared at it as though someone had struck him. Eleanor had never seen that ribbon before. Callum had. He remembered it from years earlier, from a photograph carried by a family he had never been able to forget. His breathing changed. He asked Maisie where she had found it, but she could not explain clearly. Eleanor finally understood that this was connected to the terrible event that had caused her daughter's withdrawal. She had always believed the incident was simply a traumatic accident. But Callum's reaction suggested there was something else. Before Eleanor could demand an explanation, a Foundation volunteer approached them and accidentally mentioned Callum's military background. Eleanor looked at him differently. The quiet single father was not merely an event worker. He was a former Navy SEAL with a past connected somehow to the most painful chapter of her daughter's childhood. Eleanor wanted answers, but Callum refused to discuss the matter in front of the children. He asked if they could speak somewhere quiet, and Eleanor agreed. They moved to a sunlit garden terrace outside the ballroom while Finn and Maisie sat with a trusted volunteer nearby. Callum finally explained that years earlier, while serving overseas, he had been involved in a rescue operation after an attack on a humanitarian convoy. Among the civilians evacuated that day was a little girl whose mother had been seriously injured. The child had been clutching a blue ribbon tied around her wrist. Callum had carried her to safety. He remembered promising her that she would see her mother again, even though deep inside he knew the mother was unlikely to survive. The girl had survived, but the mother had died before medical help could save her. Eleanor listened with growing disbelief. She realized the dates matched the trip during which Maisie had experienced her trauma. Her daughter had been nearby when a vehicle accident occurred involving another family. Eleanor had always been told that a military veteran had helped rescue several people before emergency crews arrived. She had never known his identity because the official report had contained little information. Callum slowly realized that Maisie had been one of the children there. The blue ribbon had belonged to another little girl, a child who had been rescued alongside her. Maisie had witnessed the aftermath, and perhaps somewhere inside her frightened memory, Callum had become connected to the moment she lost her sense of safety. But the biggest revelation was still waiting. Eleanor discovered that Callum had not caused the tragedy. He had been the person who had entered the wreckage when everyone else hesitated. He had pulled Maisie free from a damaged vehicle, carried her away from danger, and stayed beside her until paramedics arrived. He had saved her life. Yet Callum carried the belief that he had failed because another child could not be saved. For years he had blamed himself for a decision made in seconds under impossible circumstances. Eleanor felt something inside her collapse. She had spent 2 years trying to understand why her daughter had become silent, while the man who had saved her had spent those same years believing he had failed her. Maisie suddenly approached from the garden and stood beside Callum. She reached for his hand. Eleanor watched as her daughter looked at him with a mixture of fear and recognition. Callum did not pull away. Instead, he gently held her hand and let her decide how close she wanted to stand. For the first time in years, Maisie began to tell the story trapped inside her. Her words came slowly, broken by tears. She remembered the accident, the noise, the fear, and a man carrying her away while telling her she was safe. She remembered seeing another little girl crying for her mother. She remembered thinking that if she stopped talking, perhaps nobody would ever be hurt again. Eleanor finally understood that her daughter's silence had not been stubbornness or weakness. It had been her way of surviving something she could not understand. Callum knelt beside her and admitted that he had remembered her too. He told her that he had wondered for years whether she was okay. He had never known her name. He had never known what became of her. Hearing that she was alive had been one of the most painful and beautiful surprises of his life. Maisie squeezed his hand and asked whether he had been scared. Callum smiled through tears and admitted that he had been terrified. He explained that being brave never meant feeling no fear. Sometimes bravery simply meant doing the next right thing while your heart was shaking. Eleanor watched her daughter listen to those words, and something changed inside her. For years she had tried to protect Maisie by controlling everything around her. She had chosen schools, therapists, schedules, security teams, and doctors. She had believed money could build a wall strong enough to keep pain away. But now she understood that healing was not a wall. Healing was a door, and sometimes the person who helped you open it was someone you never expected to meet. Yet Eleanor had one more obstacle to overcome: herself. She had quietly judged Callum when she first saw him. She had assumed that a man working security at her foundation could never understand the complicated world of her family. She had mistaken humility for weakness and simplicity for lack of ambition. Now she saw a man who had carried unbearable memories without asking anyone to pity him. She saw a father who had raised his son with tenderness after losing the woman he loved. She saw a soldier who had saved a child and then spent years blaming himself for the one he could not save. Over the following weeks, Eleanor allowed Callum to remain part of their lives, not because she needed someone to protect her daughter, but because Maisie trusted him. Callum never tried to become Maisie's hero. He never pushed her to speak. He simply sat with her, walked beside her, and taught her small things that made the world feel less frightening. He taught her how to recognize people who were nervous, how to breathe when memories became overwhelming, and how courage could exist in quiet moments. Finn became Maisie's friend, and the two children began spending afternoons drawing pictures in the garden while their parents watched from a nearby bench. Eleanor and Callum also began changing each other. Callum taught Eleanor that not every problem required money, control, or immediate solutions. Sometimes people simply needed someone willing to stay. Eleanor taught Callum that surviving his past did not mean he had to remain imprisoned by it. She encouraged him to work with veterans and trauma survivors, using the skills he had learned to help others who believed their lives had ended with their hardest memories. For the first time since leaving the military, Callum began to see his past not only as something painful but as something that could be transformed into service. Months later, Eleanor hosted another foundation gathering, again during a bright afternoon. This time, Maisie stood beside her mother without hiding behind her dress. Callum arrived with Finn, and the little boy proudly showed Maisie a wooden birdhouse they had built together. When Eleanor looked across the garden, she saw something she had once believed impossible. Her daughter was laughing openly. Then Maisie walked toward Callum and placed a small blue ribbon in his hand. It was not the old ribbon from the accident. It was a new one she had made herself. She had written a single word on it: brave. Callum stared at it, unable to speak. Eleanor watched him wipe away a tear before Finn wrapped his arms around his father's waist. Eleanor approached Callum, and for once she did not see the former seal, the single father, or the mysterious man from her daughter's past. She simply saw the person who had walked into their lives at exactly the moment they needed him. Callum looked at Eleanor with the same uncertainty he had carried from the beginning, but this time she reached for his hand. There was no dramatic promise, no perfect fairy tale, and no guarantee that the future would be easy. There was simply a choice to keep walking forward together. Maisie watched them holding hands and smiled. Then she whispered something that made both adults laugh through their tears. She told them that she thought her mother had finally found someone who was brave enough to stay. The billionaire who once believed she could buy protection for everyone she loved finally understood that the greatest form of security was not a fortress, a fortune, or a private army. It was having people who stayed when life became difficult. Callum discovered that forgiveness was not forgetting the people he had lost, it was allowing himself to live for the people who remained. Maisie discovered that silence could protect you for a while, but eventually, the right person could make your voice feel safe again. And Eleanor discovered that sometimes the person who enters your life carrying the heaviest scars is the person who teaches you how to heal. Before the story ends, ask yourself this: have you ever mistaken someone's silence for weakness, or someone's past for a reason to judge them? If this story touched your heart, leave a meaningful comment about what you believe true courage means, or share one lesson you are taking from Maisie and Callum's journey. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes the person who saves us does not arrive wearing a uniform or carrying a medal. Sometimes they arrive quietly, carrying their own wounds, raising a child, trying to rebuild a life, and simply choosing to be kind when the world has given them every reason not to be. And sometimes, the most beautiful second chance begins with one frightened child finding the courage to whisper a few words to a stranger, and that stranger finally realizing that the life he thought was broken beyond repair still had something beautiful left to give.